This is my 130th video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part will deal with adding various figures, staff, passengers, etc., and a couple more road vehicles to my shelf layout. I had some figures left over from before, and I bought more figures at the Great British Train Show in Brampton, Ontario, Canada at the end of April. I also had 3 vehicles to use on the shelf layout, a 1920s bus that I'd placed before, but now I wanted to add some figures to it, and a tractor and a horse-drawn bread van that I just bought. I had added benches to the stations on my shelf layout, but so far there was nobody sitting on any of them. The only seated figures that I had previously were some unpainted ones from a Slater's set in white at top left here. At the train show I bought 3 sets of Pricer seated figures. There was a bit of a scale problem. The Pricer figures were in 1:90 scale. Why? That's too small even for HO, which is supposed to be 1:87 so far as I know, unless the Germans do it differently. Certainly OO scale is 1:76, so the Pricer figures were definitely to be expected to be on the small side, whereas the Slater's figures should be true OO scale. Still, I thought that I should be able to get away with using the Pricer figures. This is the driver's seat on the 1920s bus that I had. Now I wanted to add a driver. In this case it was perhaps just as well that the Pricer figures were on the small side, as there wasn't much room. I glued one of the Pricer seated figures in place. It seemed to me that he actually fitted quite well. So now the bus had a driver. What about a passenger or two, and perhaps a conductor? For most of the figure placement in this whole exercise I used Beacon 3-in-1 glue, which was recommended to me in a comment in a previous video. I did find that this worked better than the Woodland Scenic Accents glue that I had been trying to use for figure placement before. The 3-in-1 is thick and gloopy as it comes, and also transparent as it comes. It's thick enough that it will hold light things like plastic figures in place immediately. It actually takes quite a while to dry, but it holds the figures in place directly out of the bottle. I didn't find it of much use for fixing heavier things, such as repairs to rolling stock, as it does take quite a while to set, and heavier things will fall apart until the glue sets, so they'd have to be clamped. But for this sort of thing, spotting plastic figures into place, the 3-in-1 worked well. I put another of the Pricer seated figures onto the front seat of the top deck, and a chap in a grey uniform further back as a conductor. I bought this Oxford model of a tractor from British Model Trains in Cambridge, Ontario. I actually tried to buy the grey version of this tractor, but when Nigel looked for it he couldn't find it, so he thought that it had probably been stolen at a show. He did have this green version and a blue one, so I went with the green, although I really thought that the grey would have looked better for the 1930s, which is my period. Here's the tractor with the cover of the box taken off. And here it is detached from the base. Oxford certainly packed things well in those little display cases, and it can be a bit of a performance managing to get them out. I put another of the Pricer figures onto the seat of the tractor. It was a tight fit getting him in behind the steering wheel. With cars you can sometimes just cut the legs off the driver figure, but I didn't want to do that here as it would have been obvious. At the Great British Train Show I bought this days gone model of a horse-drawn bread van. Again, there's a scale problem here. No scale is actually mentioned on the packaging, but clearly this is a bit big for OO. The problem isn't too bad for the vehicle itself, at least I didn't think so. If you assume that's a fairly large horse, I could see the van as being believable in 1:76 scale. On the other hand, the 3 figures that came with it were very clearly much too big. In the centre here is the driver figure that came with the bread van. On the left is one of the Slater's figures, presumably true 00 scale, and on the right is one of the Pricer figures, which are 1 to 90. I'd say the bread van figure is about 1 to 50 scale. I decided that I would use the bread van, but rather than using the much too large driver figure that came with it, I'd substitute one of the Slater's figures. This one seemed to be about the best to be a driver. I painted the Slater's figure as best as I could. I find it hard to do much in the way of detail when painting 00 scale figures. I cut the figure from the sprue and finished off the painting at top and bottom. And here he is seated in the van. Not quite right, I guess, but not horribly unbelievable. I put the vehicles onto the layout. The bus went back where I had it before, parked outside Wenstead Station. I do think it looks better now it's got someone on board. There isn't really much scenery on the shelf layout. The tractor just went onto a patch of grass beside the tracks. I think it looks fairly reasonable there. I dither constantly as to whether to use flash for photos. It makes the pics sharper and brighter, but it creates excessive shadow and contrast. Pics without flash are more natural looking, if sometimes a bit fuzzy. Here's the bus without flash. I put the bread van outside Hatley Station. It's really too close to the end of the track. The shelf layout is all round pretty approximate scenically. Next, I wanted to place some general passenger and staff figures. I bought a bag of figures at the train show. These were, I believe, mostly Airfix figures. They had been painted, but for some reason quite a lot of the paint was chipped off. I sorted them out and started to repair the paintwork. Rather than completely repainting, I tried to match the colours and just repair the chipped bits. Here I've done a bit more. My colour matches weren't exact, but I think they'll more or less work in natural light. I finished off by adding some flesh tones where appropriate. I bought this set of old metal staff figures from British model trains. They're not exactly very detailed, but they have a certain nostalgia value. With flash you can see that a lot of the paint has come off these, but I didn't attempt to repaint them. I wanted to use this Slater's seated couple as I didn't have anything else in the way of a couple. I did my best to paint the Slater's couple. I arranged all of the figures in a tray and took them up to the layout. The metal staff figures are at bottom right. The rest of the bottom 3 rows are the Airfix figures with touched-up paint. Above that are the Slater's couple and the Pricer seated figures. Then in the top 2 rows various figures that I had left over from before. I stuck the figures using the 3-in-1 glue into various places, mainly on the stations. Here's Hatley Station, now quite busy. I put seated figures, including the Slater's couple, onto the Metcalfe benches. I put various figures here and there, trying to make them look somewhat as if they were actually doing something, or at least waiting naturally. I put figures into the kiosks, as clearly there needed to be someone inside to sell things. I tended to group the porters with passengers. I put a couple of figures over by the water tower and the signal box. Here's a general view of Wenstead Station after I added figures. Although I haven't really properly modelled a road, I put a couple of figures outside beside the station buildings, including a policeman and a newspaper vendor. I put various groups onto the platforms. I guess that conductor in the bus could really do with touching up a bit. I put a seller into this kiosk too, and a customer outside, and generally figures here and there on benches or waiting for trains with their luggage, right down to the ends of the platforms. Here's a view back into the station. It would have been more realistic if I'd cut the figures off their bases, but then it's hard to get them to stand up at all. I put some figures round the Wenstead signal box also, and the little cottage or whatever that building is. And I put a few figures in other places, a metal figure and some sort of surveyor here by the hut between the siding and the main line. Here's a view into Hatley Station. And here into the end of Wenstead Station. Folks at the end of platform 2. And looking right into Wenstead Station along the tracks. And the best I could manage for looking into Hatley Station. As a last thought, I added a customer for the Scaledale kiosk. So that's it for now. Detailing of the stations isn't complete. I still have a bunch of other small things to add. Trolleys, weighing machines, more luggage, lamps, etc. And maybe some advertising signs. But at least the railway doesn't appear deserted now. In fact, it appears rather busy.